The envelope didn't match the rest of the mail scattered on my porch that morning. Amid credit card offers and an overdue water bill, it stood out, heavy, cream-colored, sealed in rose gold wax, with Lena's familiar cursive swirling across the front. I knew what it was before I touched it. My younger sister was getting married, and for reasons I couldn't immediately decipher, she had decided to invite me. I stared at it for a long time without opening it, not because I didn't care, but because I cared more than I wanted to admit. We hadn't spoken in a year, not since that Thanksgiving dinner when Lena, wineglass in hand, called me too much. Not directly to me, of course. She said it to the table, loud enough for everyone who mattered to hear. Vanessa's always been the intense one. Men get one whiff of that private equity power woman energy and run for the hills. She smiled sweetly. She's just intimidating. That word had followed me most of my life. Too sharp, too direct, too successful for comfort. I didn't argue. I stood, gathered my coat, and left. I hadn't returned since. So why this envelope? Why now? I peeled back the seal with steady fingers. The invitation was just what I expected. Elegant, oversized, the kind of paper you keep just to prove you were included. Her wedding would take place at Hawthorne Estate, a world-class vineyard tucked into the hills of Napa Valley. Glass-walled reception halls, winding garden paths, wine that sold for $800 a bottle. A venue chosen for image, but built on something far more private. A location I knew better than she realized. 2 years ago, Monroe and Langston, my firm, quietly acquired a majority stake in that vineyard through one of our shell companies. It was struggling then, though few people knew. We restructured the debt, replaced management, and let it keep its romantic branding. We didn't need credit. I didn't need credit. I just needed the margins to rise, and they did. Now Lena had booked it. For her wedding. To showcase a version of herself to Daniel's family. And she had no idea she was walking into a place I partially owned. I leaned back in my porch chair and took a sip of my coffee, letting the moment sink in. I could have laughed. I could have torn the invitation in half and moved on. But I didn't, because something inside me shifted, something I'd carried for years. The ache of being overlooked, minimized, and misunderstood gave way to something quieter, sharper. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize you're no longer the one outside the story, but the one underwriting it. I remembered when my mother asked, yet again, why I wasn't dating anyone. I remembered the way my father's face fell every time I declined another family dinner. I remembered the whispers. Vanessa's hard to read. She's cold. She thinks she's better than us. And I understood. This wedding wasn't just a celebration for Lena. It was a curated narrative meant to reinforce who fit and who didn't. A stage play designed to comfort the people who had never known what to do with me. But they had picked the wrong venue. Because this wasn't just an invitation to attend, it was a quiet opening, a door, left slightly ajar. And on the other side was a room I already helped build. I didn't need to raise my voice. My success didn't need applause. It was cemented, right there in the beams, the contracts, the soil, woven invisibly into the very place where they would toast to a life Lena believed she had curated entirely on her own. I looked at the RSVP card, its return envelope lined in gold. The dress code read black tie. A full weekend itinerary, a guest list, no doubt, crafted to reflect legacy. I circled yes with a steady hand, sealed it, and set it at the edge of the table like a decision already made. But before I stood up, I allowed myself one final thought. They think this is her story. They have no idea the foundation beneath their feet is mine. The weekend of the wedding arrived quicker than I anticipated. Despite my usual ability to stay emotionally removed from family affairs, this trip carried a different weight. Not just because I'd be seeing Lena again, but because I knew I'd be stepping onto a stage they thought they controlled, unaware that the foundation beneath their carefully arranged place cards was partially mine. That's the thing about wedding drama. It never waits for the ceremony to begin. It starts with the guest list, the whispered judgments behind champagne glasses, the invisible pecking order decided before anyone even steps out of their car. And I was about to walk right into it. I arrived at Hawthorne Estate alone, driving my black Tesla slowly through the winding Vineyard roads. The GPS wasn't necessary. I had memorized this route 2 years ago during meetings that saved this place from collapse. Now the vines stood proud again, the stone fountain sparkled in the midday sun, and the staff wore perfectly pressed uniforms I had quietly approved during the renovation phase. As I pulled into the valet circle, I caught the curious glance of a young attendant. I stepped out, heels clicking against the slate driveway. "Ms. Monroe?" he asked, scanning a clipboard. "You're not on the family's guest room list. You must be one of the late RSVPs?" "No," I replied evenly. "I booked my own suite at the inn." I watched his brows lift slightly, the kind of reaction that wasn't rude, but made clear he hadn't expected poise to arrive in private equity packaging, not just who I was to the bride, but what my presence meant. Inside, the energy buzzed with practiced elegance. Guests had already arrived and were gathered on the terrace for welcome drinks. Everything gleamed, from the polished glasses to the cascading blush arrangements. I spotted Lena at the far end, laughing with a circle of women I didn't recognize, likely Daniel's relatives. She was dressed in a linen romper, hair twisted into an effortless chignon, the picture of relaxed charm. I didn't approach. I made my way to the bar instead. From the corner of my eye, I felt it. The glances, not from Lena, but from 2 sharply dressed women seated nearby, whispering too loudly to be subtle. One, a petite blonde with pearl earrings and the clipped diction of old wealth, muttered, "She must be one of Lena's single friends. Came solo? That's bold." The other swirled her cocktail. "She looks like she's here to review someone's tax filings, not to celebrate." Their laughter was polite, practiced, almost musical, the kind people use when they think the target isn't listening. I didn't flinch. I'd heard worse. In boardrooms, at family dinners, in holiday kitchens where no one said my name but everyone hinted at who I was. What caught my attention wasn't the insult, it was the confidence with which they delivered it. These women didn't recognize me as the bride's sister. They didn't consider I might be someone worth knowing, and that's how wedding drama really starts, not through arguments but through erasure. Minutes later, I heard my name. "Vanessa," called across the terrace. I turned to find Lena approaching, arms outstretched. Her tone was bright, but her eyes moved too quickly over my outfit, my posture, the understated Cartier watch on my wrist. She hugged me lightly. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't either," I said, offering a small smile. "You look powerful," she added with a nervous laugh, as if it were both compliment and caution. "And you look radiant," I replied. "Congratulations." Before we could say more, a tall man in a pale gray linen suit joined us, her fiancé, Daniel. I had seen him in photos before, posed in galleries, on yachts, beside family crests. His handshake was firm, his smile thin. "I've heard about you," he said. "The ambitious sister." I arched an eyebrow. "All good things, I hope." Lena chuckled quickly. "Of course, Vanessa's brilliant. She practically lives in airports, always, somewhere." The way she said it, airbrushed, dismissive, was familiar, like she was softening a threat into a punchline. Daniel nodded like he was summarizing a spreadsheet. "Finance, right?" "Private equity." "Ah, high stakes." He said it like that explained everything. We didn't speak much after that. They were pulled away by one of Daniel's aunts needing approval on table arrangements. I stayed by the bar, quietly watching the map of social power being drawn, who stood closest to the bride, who had already been relegated to polite irrelevance. Every now and then someone would ask, "So who are you here with?" or "bride or groom's side?" as if the idea of me being family didn't compute. Later that evening, during the welcome dinner, I was placed at a table near the back. Not with family, not even close. Sandwiched between a wedding planner's assistant and a third cousin of the groom who sold orthopedic devices in Phoenix. I didn't complain, because I understood something too many of them didn't. Seating isn't just logistics, it's code. And what they didn't know was that I wasn't insulted. I was gathering data. Positioning tells you everything. Who they want to be seen beside, who they want to forget. and who they underestimate. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip, not out of nervousness, out of patience, because what they didn't know was that the woman they thought didn't belong helped design the floors they were dancing on. It was amazing how fast a label could travel in rooms like this without anyone ever saying your name. You could walk into a manicured courtyard, dressed in muted elegance, and by your second drink, the whispers had already settled into shape. Not a real one, of course, just a convenient outline for other people's discomfort. I had become that woman, the one who didn't smile wide enough, the one who stood a little too tall, the one whose resume spoke louder than her jewelry. "You know who she is, right?" I heard someone murmur at the edge of the rehearsal brunch tent the next morning. "She's the older sister, the career one." Another voice chimed in, lower but rich with fake empathy. "I heard she intimidates most men, one of those high-powered types who never learned how to be soft." I didn't flinch. Not because I was immune, but because I'd heard these words since girlhood, only now they wore better outfits and drank better wine. They weren't just talking about me. They were repeating the same verdict that had shadowed me through every holiday table, every family photo cropped too neatly, that I was too much, too deliberate, too unwilling to shrink myself into something more palatable. But what they didn't know was that I'd learned how to hear that judgment early, not just in corporate boardrooms, in my own childhood kitchen. Our father praised Lena for her grace, for her ability to smooth over tension, make people laugh, blend. He praised me for being useful, for solving problems, paying bills, stepping in when our mother's illness rearranged the family calendar. He saw me as reliable, but not tender, present, but never invited. So I adapted. I built walls that didn't crumble. I mastered calm when others needed chaos. And in doing so, I made peace with the fact that my comfort made others uncomfortable. Still, as I sipped my mimosa under the tent's filtered light, the commentary continued. "I mean, just look at her posture," one woman whispered. "She sits like she's running a quarterly earnings call." The other let out a cocktail-soaked laugh. "Maybe she is." They thought I couldn't hear them. Or worse, they didn't care if I could. Across the lawn, Lena posed for photos in a soft blue silk dress, laughing with Daniel's extended family like she'd never had to stretch to fit in. She waved at me once, more out of obligation than invitation. And yet, I didn't regret coming. Because I wasn't here for their approval. I was here to observe, like a structural engineer watching a house that had been built to impress collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. Midway through brunch, a man in his 60s approached. Crisp linen suit, tortoiseshell glasses, a gold Rolex that likely predated the Vineyard itself. "Vanessa Monroe?" he asked, his voice smooth, deliberate. I stood slowly. "Yes?" "I'm Edward Langford, Daniel's uncle. Technically retired, but I still hover around the family foundation." He motioned to the empty seat beside me. "May I?" "Please." He sat, crossing one leg with elegant control. "I saw you arrive yesterday. You looked familiar." "Perhaps from a headline," I said. "I've worked on a few regional projects that made waves." His eyes sparked with memory. "Ah, Monroe and Langston. Now I remember. You're the one who orchestrated this estate's turnaround. You're one of the quiet owners." I tilted my head slightly. "You know that?" "My firm almost bid on this place 5 years ago, before things went south. We followed the acquisition closely. You kept your name out of the press. Smart." I didn't answer immediately, but something shifted. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "They don't know, do they?" I shook my head once. "Not yet." He chuckled softly. "You're playing the long game. I respect that." Before I could respond, a woman approached. Daniel's mother, though I hadn't met her yet. She wore a buttercream blouse and a mask of charms so smooth it gleamed. "Edward," she said brightly. "Found yourself a friend?" He stood. "This is Vanessa Monroe, Lena's sister." Her smile faltered, just for a second, just enough to register. "Oh," she said, Yes, of course, the finance one. The underestimated woman, Edward added, eyes steady. Her laugh was brittle. We've heard so much about you. You must be very busy. I make time when it matters, I replied, holding her gaze long enough to make her shift her weight. She turned to Edward. Come, they're calling for family photos. He gave me a small nod. We'll speak again. And then they were gone. But something had changed. Edward knew exactly who I was, not just in title but in force. And now he was in the room, a man with presence, a man the family clearly respected, and he knew I wasn't just a guest. I was infrastructure. After brunch, as guests drifted toward tastings and sun-soaked photo shoots, I lingered. I walked the grounds slowly, tracing the path between the renovated barrel rooms and the patio where I once signed deal papers under a discreet LLC. And for the first time all weekend, I allowed myself to feel something. Not pride, not vengeance, clarity. This wasn't about proving myself to Lena or anyone else sipping curated cocktails in pastel dresses. This was about being fully present in a space they never imagined I belonged to, and never announcing that I did. Because the real underestimated woman isn't the one they talk about. It's the one who built the room they're whispering in, without needing to be introduced. I wasn't supposed to be this woman. If you had asked my mother when I was 12, or my father when I graduated college, they would have described a very different future for me, one shaped by family expectations and softened by proximity to tradition. In their vision, I would have married young, perhaps someone in law. We'd buy a respectable house in the suburbs, attend church on Sundays, host barbecues on the 4th of July. I'd work, sure, but nothing too demanding. Something flexible, something that wouldn't interfere with PTA meetings or holiday travel. Instead, I became Vanessa Monroe, partner at Monroe and Langston, the only woman in the room more often than I could count, the one whose decisions closed deals worth more than the combined lifetime income of everyone seated at that wedding brunch. And while my resume made some people nod in admiration, it made others, especially those raised on very specific visions of womanhood, deeply uncomfortable. That discomfort always simmered beneath the surface in my family. Lena was the golden girl, the one who stayed close, the one who made choices that felt familiar to our parents. She didn't rebel, she harmonized. She didn't challenge traditions, she fit neatly within them. It was no surprise that her wedding was a performance of everything they once hoped I'd want: an estate venue, family photos in color-coordinated outfits, and speeches that would lean heavily on concepts like legacy, loyalty, and settling down. I remember when I first told my father that I wasn't going to pursue medicine or law, I wanted business, finance specifically. He looked at me like I'd announced I was moving to another planet. That's not a field for women who want a family, he'd said, not unkindly, but with a finality that carved itself into the back of my mind. You'll never find a man who wants to keep up with that. Later, when I bought my first apartment, a sleek loft in the heart of San Francisco, my mother smiled tightly and asked, "Don't you think it's too much space for just one person?" What she meant was, why are you planning for independence when you should be planning for partnership? And so I stopped explaining myself. I simply did the work. Quietly, persistently. At first, I thought success would eventually translate into acceptance, that the right balance sheet, the right real estate deal, or the right conference keynote would earn me what I craved most. Not applause, but acknowledgement. Not celebration, but understanding. But the more I achieved, the more distance seemed to grow between us. That's what made Lena's wedding invitation so hard to read. It wasn't just paper. It was a mirror, showing me everything I was supposed to want, but didn't. The image of a family reunion, but with seating charts that told you where you really stood. And yet, I came, not to prove a point, but because something inside me wanted to look that old narrative in the eye and say, "You didn't define me. You never could." Back at the estate, the day before the wedding, the rehearsals began. I hadn't been asked to participate in the ceremony, which didn't surprise me, but I still watched. I sat quietly beneath an oak tree as Lena and Daniel practiced walking down the aisle with the officiant. His family, Boston pedigrees, generational wealth wrapped in pastel linen, circled around, offering input like it was a board meeting. One woman in particular, Daniel's aunt, I learned, clapped her hands and laughed at a line Lena fumbled. "Well, I suppose no family's perfect," she said brightly. "Some of us just carry more edge than others." Lena glanced toward me just for a moment, then looked away. She didn't defend me. She never did. That had been our silent agreement for years. I'd stay on the periphery of her world, successful, distant, polite, and she'd never have to explain why I didn't fit into the mold of the sister who helped plan the seating chart or attended the dress fittings. It was more comfortable that way. Until now. That night, I returned to my inn and sat in front of the fireplace, scrolling through the digital portfolio we'd used when rebuilding Hawthorne Estate. Every line item, every investment note, my name on every strategic signature. Hidden, yes, but real. A text buzzed on my phone. From Lena. "Glad you came. I know we're different, but I do appreciate you being here." I stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It was a peace offering, dipped in politeness and tied with an invisible thread of guilt. I typed back, "We are different. That doesn't mean I'm not watching with pride. I just do it from a distance you're more comfortable with." She didn't respond, and I didn't need her to. The next day would be her wedding. But I had already begun reclaiming something for myself. Because the truth was, family expectations had almost kept me away from this entire story. They had tried to cast me in a role I never auditioned for, and when I declined, they wrote me out. But I was back now. Not as a guest, not as a sister, as a silent shareholder in the very soil beneath their feet. The wedding morning arrived with the kind of controlled chaos that only comes with events designed to impress. White tents bloomed like oversized orchids across the vineyard lawn, the florist darted between ceremony chairs with last-minute arrangements, and the wedding planner whispered orders into a headset like she was coordinating a military operation. From my suite window at the inn, I watched the entire production unfold like an orchestral rehearsal. Everything polished, everything rehearsed, everything carefully tuned for appearances. I had breakfast alone. Not by choice, necessarily, but by design. I hadn't been invited to the bridal suite. Not for hair, not for makeup, not for champagne toasts. And that was fine. I didn't need to squeeze into those spaces where I clearly wasn't meant to belong. What they hadn't realized, of course, was that while they were toasting to curated perfection, I had already walked the halls of this estate in a different capacity. Months earlier, wearing business suits instead of silk robes, signing restructuring contracts instead of guest books. Mid-morning, I made my way toward the ceremony lawn, taking the long path along the vineyard's edge. A few guests were already milling about the reception area, sipping champagne, nodding politely to each other like stockholders at a gala. These weren't people who raised voices or spilled drinks. These were quiet sharks, successful, well-groomed, trained to notice every social cue. And they had noticed me. Not recognized, but noticed. I was seated again near the outer edge of the reception space, a table tucked beside a floral wall, far enough to feel like decoration, close enough to witness everything. As I settled into my seat, two of Daniel's aunts, both in pastel dresses, both with pearl drop earrings, and that East Coast air of inherited charm, were already halfway through their second glass of Veuve Clicquot. "I still can't believe Daniel's marrying a girl from California," one said, not bothering to whisper. "I mean, Lena is lovely, but the family's a bit fractured, don't you think?" The other nodded. "I met the sister yesterday. What's her name again? Vanessa?" "She's intense," the first replied. "She just stares, makes you feel like she's measuring the ROI of your soul." They both laughed, full-throated and delighted. "She's the one in finance, right?" "Private equity, I heard. No husband, no children, probably has a penthouse and an espresso machine more expensive than my wedding ring. Honestly, I admire it, in theory, but would you want that in your family? Someone like that around your son?" More laughter. I took a slow sip of my water and kept my face neutral. Not because I was hurt. Not anymore. It was something else entirely. A quiet knowing. A power they didn't see coming because it didn't wear the right dress or use the right tone. They were too distracted by champagne and their own assumptions to notice the truth sitting beside them. Later, during the cocktail hour before the ceremony, I found myself wandering past the edge of the tent toward the barrel room. It was quiet there, shaded and cool. A man stepped out from the shadow, Edward Langford, the billionaire uncle. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "You don't strike me as a canapé and crowds kind of woman." I allowed a smile. "And yet I do clean up well." "You do," he nodded with a glint of humor. "But I imagine you prefer substance to spectacle." He handed me a folded paper napkin, balancing a single champagne flute on top. I accepted both. "They're still talking," he said casually. "Daniel's side, I mean. The women especially. They have theories." "They usually do." "They assume you're dangerous." "Because I'm not afraid of silence?" "Because you make them feel replaceable." We stood quietly for a moment as the wind picked up through the vines. I looked down at the champagne glass, bubbles climbing like ambition toward the rim. "Edward," I said quietly, "you know who owns majority shares in this estate, don't you?" He smiled slowly. "I do." "And you know how ironic it is that they think I'm just someone who doesn't belong." "Ironic," he repeated, "is not nearly a strong enough word." "They laugh over champagne and family secrets," I murmured, mostly to myself. "But the real joke is how little they know." "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "I'm not trying to." I turned toward the path back to the main event. "I just want to be here when it dawns on them." He laughed softly, the way only powerful men do when they meet someone who doesn't flinch. Back under the main tent, the seating was shifting as ceremony time neared. I took my seat once more, and this time, when I looked up, Daniel's mother made eye contact. Her smile was thin, but she nodded. A signal of acknowledgement. Not approval, not welcome, just awareness. I returned the nod. For the first time all weekend, I wasn't invisible. And I didn't need to say a word. Most of the wedding guests who walked through the arched iron gates of Hawthorne Estate that afternoon marveled at its beauty as if it had been built solely for this day, sunlight pouring through the canopy of sycamores, honey-colored stonework glowing against the green of late summer vines, and white petals falling softly from overhead baskets like a living dream. To them, it was magic, but to me, it was memory. A carefully revived place where every inch of elegance once masked the stench of foreclosure. I had first stepped onto this property 2 years ago, long before Lena ever added it to her Pinterest board. It was early spring then, and the estate looked very different. The vines were wild and untrimmed, the fountain in the center of the courtyard had stopped flowing, and the staff, those who remained, had a look of quiet desperation in their eyes. They had held out hope for months that an investor might come, someone who would do more than extract value and leave the place gutted. I was that someone. The luxury estate had been a whispered project inside Monroe and Langston's West Coast division for months, an under-leveraged but storied vineyard in a location ripe for revitalization. I volunteered to lead the evaluation. No one expected me to say yes. They thought it beneath my portfolio. But I remembered this region from childhood drives with my mother, back when we used to visit local farmers markets and stop to peek at tasting rooms we couldn't afford. I wanted to walk this soil again. I wanted to rebuild something quiet, enduring, and beautiful. When I arrived for the first site inspection, the owner's grandson, Julian, greeted me with a firm handshake and a nervous smile. His family had owned Hawthorne for 3 generations, but they were drowning in unpaid taxes and supply chain debt. We toured the estate for hours, speaking in low voices about everything from structural repairs to marketing strategy. He had vision, but no capital. I had capital, but no reason to be sentimental. Until I saw the library. Hidden on the north side of the main house, tucked behind a wide mahogany door, it was sunlit and forgotten. Shelves lined with dusty books, a grand piano pushed against the window, and a tiny card on the table that read, "For those who care enough to stay curious." I cared. That night, I sent a quiet proposal through a holding company we used for discreet acquisitions. Julian agreed within days. He stayed on as a creative director, and I never attached my name to the paperwork. The estate was revived, slowly and with precision, repairs funded, staff retained, branding refreshed. By the following year, Hawthorne Estate had become a premier event space again, booked solid, buzzing with whispers of being the Vineyard that came back to life. But no one outside my firm knew the truth, not even Lena. Which is why, as I stood beneath the same sycamore trees on her wedding day, listening to classical music swirl from hidden speakers and guests fawn over the venue's timeless charm, the irony wasn't lost on me. I had rebuilt the backdrop of her dream day, without her knowing. The wedding planner swept by, adjusting the aisle runner. A photographer snapped candids of Daniel's mother arranging her necklace with theatrical grace, and the officiant, some high-profile celebrant with an NPR voice, was doing mic checks near the altar. I lingered near the outer circle, not as decoration, not as family, but as something else entirely. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a woman beside me said, raising her phone to take a picture. "I heard the estate nearly went bankrupt a few years ago. Some genius turned it around." "Must have taken vision," I replied softly. "And deep pockets," she laughed. Across the aisle I saw Lena again, her veil pinned into place by one of the bridesmaids, her dress cascading in layers of ivory silk. She looked radiant, untouchable, happy. And I wondered, had she ever asked herself why Hawthorne had survived long enough for her to marry here? Or was it just another curated detail in a day designed to project perfection? I wasn't bitter. I wasn't even waiting for recognition anymore. I had no desire to stand up and announce my role in the estate's rebirth. That wasn't my style. My power had never been loud. But I wanted to remember that when everyone else saw luxury, I had once seen potential. That while others posed for photos, I had stood in the mud with engineers and designers, arguing over drainage lines and building permits. That while Lena's guests toasted with $300 wine, I had reviewed the original fermentation schedules to ensure cost margins aligned with projected branding. This wasn't just a luxury estate. This was one of my quiet legacies, and perhaps the only one I'd ever let Lena borrow without asking for anything in return. The ceremony began, and I took my seat. Not in the front, not among the bridal party, but just close enough to see her face clearly. As she walked down the aisle on our father's arm, I saw a flicker in her expression, something that looked like surprise when her eyes met mine. Not because I was there, but because I was completely at ease. I smiled gently. She looked away, and the vows began. After the ceremony ended and the guests erupted into applause, Lena and Daniel kissed beneath the flower-draped arch as if nothing had ever gone wrong in their lives. The photographer waved them forward for golden hour shots across the vineyard, while champagne was passed around like liquid praise. Laughter echoed through the courtyard. String lights flickered to life above the reception lawn. Everything shimmered in perfection's glow. But beneath that surface I moved differently. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but with precision. The kind of precision that only comes from experience, not just with people, but with systems. I'd spent over a decade in boardrooms learning when to speak and when to wait, when to sign and when to let someone talk themselves into a corner. And now, here at the estate I had helped revive, seated at the outer edges of my own sister's wedding, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't need to. This was my silent revenge. Not a spectacle, not a slap, just presence, unapologetic, undeniable, and quietly in control. While Daniel's aunts prattled on about hedge funds and European boarding schools, I stepped away. Not rudely, just briefly. I knew these halls better than any guest here, and there were still parts of the estate that held pieces of me, rooms I had designed the renovation for, corners I had signed off on, spaces that carried my name, just not out loud. I entered through the side of the great hall, where the kitchen was in full swing. Chefs plated starters, servers carried trays of miniature tartlets and seared scallops. I nodded at the head chef, who looked startled but smiled when I greeted him by name. I remembered him from the transition phase. He was one of the few original staff we'd kept on. He recognized me. "Miss Monroe?" he said under his breath, setting down a tray. "You're back." "Quietly," I said. "As always." "You saved this place. Most of them don't know." I smiled. "That's the point." I moved on before anyone could linger too long. Down the corridor, past the wine cellar, and into the restored West Wing. The doors were closed to guests, reserved for staff and estate management. But my keycard still worked. I swiped it and stepped inside. The hallway smelled of lavender and oak. The restoration team had done a phenomenal job, replacing the cracked floors, softening the lighting, restoring the old plasterwork into something that looked timeless. My firm had funded every bit of it. I walked past the framed photographs lining the walls, one of the estate's founder in 1954, another of a harvest celebration in the early 2000s. But no one would ever know that behind each photograph was a line in a spreadsheet I had signed off on, a budget I had approved. That was the heart of my silent revenge. Not grand gestures, just architecture, elegance, and empire, wrapped in subtlety. They laughed at me with champagne-stained teeth, unaware that the room around them bore my fingerprints. The bricks, the brass doorknobs, the wine labels, they were mine in ways they couldn't see. Back in the reception tent, Edward Langford caught my eye. He lifted his glass slightly. A private toast. I returned it with a nod. He knew. That was enough. I didn't care if Daniel's family continued calling me too intimidating. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need a scene. They had given me the gift of dismissal, and I had accepted it, because being underestimated is an advantage. It creates space, and in that space I had built something much larger than approval. I had built legacy. Later, as the night deepened and candles flickered across long banquet tables, Lena gave her speech. She thanked their parents, Daniel's mentors, the guests who had flown from Europe. She spoke of love and partnership and finding someone who makes you feel like home. She didn't mention me, but when her voice cracked, just for a second, as she thanked those who taught her what strength looks like, she glanced toward the back of the room. It was brief, maybe even accidental, but it was there. I clinked my glass once and raised it in the air, not for show, just for me. And maybe, just maybe, for her. Because behind the vineyard's walls, hidden in its wood and wine, my silent revenge had never been about making them feel small. It had always been about standing exactly where I was, whole, unseen, and undeniable. The reception was in full bloom by the time I returned from the West Wing. Twinkle lights floated above the tent like suspended stars, and soft jazz pulsed beneath the laughter of the newly married and comfortably powerful. Servers floated past with trays of seared lamb and roasted fig tartlets. I slipped back into my seat, invisible once more, but only because I chose to be. Across the room, Daniel moved like a man who belonged everywhere, confident, charming, effortlessly navigating his family's social maze. I watched him the way I used to watch CEOs before a pitch, taking mental notes, measuring rhythm, waiting for the moment they stopped performing and started revealing themselves. That moment came sooner than expected. It was just after the first dance. The crowd had gathered near the bar, Lena glowing beside her new husband, drinks in hand. I hadn't approached them all night, and I didn't plan to. But something shifted. Daniel caught sight of me through the cluster of silk and smiles. He excused himself and walked over, loosened tie, half smile, the faint air of a man emboldened by too many quiet nods of approval. "You clean up well," he said, raising his glass. I returned the nod but didn't mirror his smirk. "It's not my first event." "No, I imagine not. I've heard about your reputation. Lena told me a bit, but others have filled in the gaps." "Others rarely get the details right," I replied, sipping my wine. He leaned against the nearby pillar, eyes sharp. "You know, when I first saw you on the guest list, I asked Lena if you were going to be a problem." "Problem?" I raised an eyebrow, amused. Not like that, he added quickly. Just intense. The kind of woman who doesn't exactly blend. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He filled the silence himself. Not that there's anything wrong with it, he added. It's just, not everyone's looking for someone like that. You know, for a wife. There it was. Not bride material. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that, but it might have been the last time I needed to. I set my glass down slowly. You're right, I said, calm as ice. I'm not looking to be bride material for someone who thinks strength is intimidating. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. No offense. None taken, I said. Then I leaned in just enough. You know this venue? The estate where you're standing right now? His brows raised. Of course, it's beautiful. I helped rescue it from bankruptcy 2 years ago. My firm owns controlling shares. I chose to keep my name off the masthead. His glass froze halfway to his lips. I'm not bride material, I said, voice steady, because I build things, venues, companies, legacies. While others plan menus, I write contracts. While others plan outfits, I move capital. He blinked. Once, twice. Lena didn't mention. She wouldn't, I said softly, and I didn't come here to change that. He shifted uncomfortably. Well, congratulations, I guess. I smiled. That's the difference, Daniel. I don't need your congratulations. I just need you to remember this moment. Then I turned, just as Edward Langford stepped up beside me, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. He had seen the entire exchange, and for the first time that evening, Daniel looked like he understood something was off, something big, something important that everyone around him had missed. You're not a problem, Edward said to me quietly. You're the solution they never expected. Daniel walked away moments later, and though he didn't stumble, his pace faltered just slightly. I returned to my seat. This was never about being bride material. It was about being undeniable. And tonight, in the estate I'd helped rebuild, standing across from a man who measured value in aesthetics and comfort, I had reminded him that real power doesn't come dressed in expectation. It walks in quietly, owns the building, and doesn't wait to be asked to dance. The air inside the reception tent had shifted, not like a breeze, but like a tightening string, subtle and stretching, waiting to snap. It might have started with the toast schedule, or maybe it began the moment Daniel returned to Lena's side, quieter than he had been all night, his charm slightly dulled. Either way, I felt it, and so did others, even if they didn't have the language for it yet. Lena took the microphone with practiced elegance, the kind she'd always worn well. Her gown glowed under the warm fairy lights, and her voice rang clear as crystal. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began, smiling to the crowd, her expression soft and curated. This day has been more perfect than I ever imagined. I watched from my corner seat, far from the head table, far from the toasts and cameras. My glass of wine sat untouched, my fingers tracing the stem, steady and unreadable. I just want to say how lucky I am, Lena continued, to be surrounded by so much love, especially from Daniel's family, who've welcomed me like one of their own from the very start. There was applause, warm and polite. And of course, she said, her smile tightening just enough to be real, to my own family, to my parents, who always supported me, and to those who, let's just say, taught me what I didn't want my future to look like. There it was. A pause, a tilt in her voice, a single cutting sentence wrapped in civility. Someone near the front laughed, just a little, not loudly, just enough to make it real. And then a ripple of silence, slow and knowing. Because she hadn't said my name, but every person in that tent knew who she meant. The woman in the back, the one who came alone, the one they whispered about behind glasses of champagne. I didn't flinch, I didn't move, but I felt it, every syllable, like ice water against skin. Lena's eyes met mine for the briefest second, not with regret, not even with doubt, but with intention. She had meant it, every word, and she was proud of it. That was the moment it clicked. This wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was her narrative, her story of triumph, her public declaration of everything she believed she had done right. And I was the shadow in her fairy tale, the mistake she was proud not to repeat, the silent warning to anyone watching that too much independence, too much ambition, too much difference meant ending up alone. It was a humiliation, yes, but more than that, it was a confirmation. She didn't want me there for support. She wanted me there as contrast. A visual lesson, seated politely, dressed in elegance, offering no threat, until she decided to use me. I stood, slowly, not abruptly, not in defiance, just calm, collected, and deliberate. I walked out of the tent without looking back. The air outside was cool against my skin, the vineyard darkening under the early night. I walked up the stone path toward the main house, the sound of celebration growing fainter with every step. I entered through a side door and made my way to the private estate office, one I had walked through years ago when signing the rescue contract that kept this place alive. Inside, it smelled of lavender and old wood. I turned on the lamp and sat at the desk, letting the silence settle. Then I reached for the black leather binder tucked beneath the drawer. Inside were the estate's revised ownership contracts. No name of mine on the masthead, of course. Just holding companies, silent partners, discreet power. But my initials were there, in ink, on every critical page. It didn't matter if I wasn't on the wedding program, my signature lived in the walls around them. The door creaked open behind me. Edward entered, his footsteps soft against the rug. He closed the door gently, watching me with the same calm he always wore. "I figured I'd find you here," he said. I didn't respond immediately. He moved closer, eyeing the binder in front of me. "She rehearsed that line, you know, that dig." "I know," I said softly. "What will you do?" "Nothing." I looked at him. "That's what she'll never understand." He raised an eyebrow. "You're choosing restraint." "I'm choosing clarity." She wanted me to react. She needed it, to validate her performance, to make her feel righteous. Edward gave a slow nod. "So instead, you walk away." "Not in defeat," I said. "In ownership. Of myself. Of this place. Of the fact that I never needed to prove anything to begin with." He looked down at the binder, then back to me. "Do you regret keeping your name off it?" "No," I said. "Not yet." We stood in the soft hum of the lamp's glow, the murmurs of distant music barely reaching through the windows. Then I smiled, not out of satisfaction, but recognition. Because this wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about presence. It was about walking into a room they thought they built and realizing you own the beams holding it up. Lena's words had stung, yes. They'd tried to carve something final into the space between us, but they'd failed. Because she didn't understand that my silence wasn't submission, it was design. And her cruelty hadn't broken me, it had simply clarified the game. This wedding humiliation had gone too far, and it had revealed far more about her than it ever could about me. I didn't return to the reception right away. The estate's office, with its heavy wooden desk and warm lamplight, felt more like home than the tent ever had. There was no applause here, no curated playlists or half-sincere speeches, just truth, and silence, and names on paper. I sat in the same chair where, nearly 2 years ago, I had reviewed the final documents before transferring the funds that saved Hawthorne Estate. Back then, the walls had smelled like mildew, and the plaster near the ceiling had cracked from years of heat and neglect. But I saw past the decay. I always had. Some people see what something is. I've always seen what it could be. And this place, this vineyard, this estate, this business, was a sleeping giant. All it needed was someone who didn't flinch at risk. Monroe and Langston never took public credit for the acquisition. We operated through a proxy firm, one that bore no direct connection to me, though I'd personally overseen the renovation plans and allocated capital from our West Coast Strategy Fund. I hadn't needed the world to know. Quiet ownership gave me what visibility never could: freedom. But tonight, that freedom tasted different. Lena's words, her careful dig disguised as charm, had settled into the corners of the estate like dust. I had walked into this wedding willing to stay silent, to be present without correction, but silence can only stretch so far before it begins to bend into something else, something sharp. I picked up the binder from the drawer, black leather, clean corners, no logo. I opened it to the property ownership record. There it was, line 4, Hawthorne Restoration Holdings, LLC, and below it, the managing partner. Not Monroe and Langston, not even my name, but my initials, VEM, standing quietly like a watermark through the entire document. They had toasted Lena's wedding as though the setting had fallen from the sky, a gift from fate, but the bricks under their feet, the very lights above their heads, they'd come back to life because I chose to save them. And now they were dancing on top of it all, laughing about intimidating women while sipping $1,000 wines I'd helped fund. I didn't want revenge in the loud sense, but a shift needed to happen, a redirection of truth, not to punish, but to clarify. Edward knocked once and entered. He'd waited, I could tell. "You're ready," he said, like it wasn't a question. I nodded. "Yes." "Come with me," he said, already walking. We moved through the hallways with ease. I didn't bother to hide the binder now. I carried it in my hand, spine outward, not for show, but for what came next. The music was softer now. The reception had shifted from dinner to post-toast mingling. Guests wandered with cake in hand, old friends reconnecting over candles and memories. I spotted Lena across the courtyard, mid-laugh, a cocktail lifted in one hand. Daniel stood nearby, watching me again, more curious than smug this time. The earlier conversation clearly hadn't left him. Edward led me straight to the event coordinator near the sound booth. "May I borrow the mic?" he asked. She hesitated for just a second before recognizing him, one of the family's most influential uncles. What could she say? He turned it on and tapped gently. The crowd's chatter quieted. "I promise not to keep you from dessert," he said, smiling. A warm chuckle rippled through the tent. "But I do want to share something about this venue, and about someone who deserves to be acknowledged." I didn't blink, didn't flinch, just watched. "Most of you know this estate has had quite a journey," he continued. "What you may not know is that it nearly went under 2 years ago. It was a shell of itself, cracked stone, crumbling walls, empty rooms." People murmured, eyes shifted, guests exchanged quiet glances. And while we were all off attending fundraisers and wine auctions, someone was here, quietly, behind the scenes, not just writing checks but rewriting its story. He looked straight at me. "I'd like to raise a glass to the woman who rebuilt Hawthorne Estate, to the person who saw what it could be when no one else would, to Vanessa Monroe, whose vision, leadership, and investment made today's celebration possible." The silence that followed was exquisite. Then a sound, glasses clinking. Then applause, scattered at first, then rising. I didn't smile, I didn't wave, I didn't bask. I nodded once, slow, grounded. Lena stood frozen. Her mouth opened slightly, something between confusion and disbelief. Daniel turned toward her, eyebrows lifted, questions forming. The guests turned, all at once seeing me not as an accessory to the wedding, but as the architecture beneath it. I didn't move to the microphone. I didn't need to. Edward's words had done enough, but as the applause faded, I stepped forward just slightly and raised the binder. "I never needed to be on the program," I said, loud enough for only a few people to hear. "I just needed the deed." And then I turned, slowly, walking away from the lights, from the fake smiles, from the hierarchy they tried to build. They had spent the whole weekend pretending I was irrelevant, but the name on the deed they never thought to read had already written the ending. The applause faded, but the ripple it created didn't. Even after the music resumed, even after the waitstaff began clearing plates and refreshing glasses, the room felt altered, recalibrated. It wasn't loud, no one gasped, no one screamed, but they looked at me differently, not like an oddity or a silent disappointment. Now they looked like people trying to remember if they had said something dismissive in front of me, if they'd ever rolled their eyes, if they'd been too confident in my insignificance. I had given them nothing dramatic. No speech, no tears, no vindication wrapped in glitter, just a name on a deed, a name they'd overlooked and now couldn't forget. I remained near the edge of the courtyard, beside a tall heater that pulsed quiet warmth through the open air. The laughter was thinner now, not gone, but muted, like people had suddenly remembered their manners. I could feel them wondering, who exactly is Vanessa Monroe? Then Edward approached me again. Not quickly, not for fanfare, just with that same calm grace he always carried, like he had nothing to prove because everything he'd done already spoke for him. "You handled that better than I would have," he said, his voice low. "I didn't handle anything," I replied. "You did." He shrugged. "I just moved the curtain. You were always standing behind it." We stood in comfortable silence for a beat, watching the lanterns sway above the dance floor. "When I was 33, he said, "I was passed over for a partnership in my own firm. They told me I was too sharp, too calculated, that clients wanted someone warmer, more familiar." He sipped his drink, then looked at me. "I built a competitor. We took half their clients in 2 years, but I didn't do it to prove them wrong. I did it because I knew who I was." I nodded slowly. "You remember that moment forever, don't you? The moment they tried to define you?" "Yes," he said, "but what I remember even more was the person who saw me differently. There was a woman, older, smarter, completely unshaken by social theater. She pulled me aside after a fundraiser one night and said, 'Don't waste time teaching people how to read you, just keep writing your legacy.'" I smiled faintly. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you," he said, "and she would have stood exactly where I'm standing right now." There was something reverent in the way he said it, not protective, not paternal, just aligned, as if he wasn't taking my side out of pity, but out of respect. That distinction mattered. "I knew when you walked into this estate years ago that you weren't just numbers on a pitch deck," he continued. "You had vision, and more importantly, you had the kind of patience most people lose in the first round of applause." "You knew who I was then?" I asked. "I always do my homework," he replied, "and I knew this day would come, when the room would catch up to you." He turned to look toward the tent again. Lena was still inside, her laughter a little more forced now. Her posture was tighter. Daniel stood beside her, distracted, occasionally glancing in our direction. I could see it clearly now, how carefully they had built their narrative, and how fragile it had become the moment the foundation they ignored spoke back. Edward stepped slightly closer. "You need to know something else," he said. "Daniel's family trusts me. My vote on the board holds weight. They listen." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because legacy is being written all the time," he said. "Even now, especially now." I raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you offering?" "I'm not offering," he said. "I'm aligning. The family's Vineyard Trust, some of their old holdings in Massachusetts, will be evaluated next quarter. They need a partner, someone with modern sense, someone who knows how to lead without needing the credit every 5 seconds. And you want that someone to be me?" "I think you already are," he said. "I just want you to know I see it, and I'm ready to stand beside it." It wasn't an offer I had expected. It wasn't even something I had wanted, necessarily. But it was something else entirely. A door. One I hadn't knocked on. One that now stood open. "What about Lena?" I asked carefully. "She's not in the way," Edward said. "She's part of the story, but she's not the writer." He held out his hand, not to shake, not to seal a deal, but as a gesture of certainty. A promise not made with fanfare, but with clarity. I took it, and that was the moment everything settled, not in noise, not in chaos, but in alignment. When the billionaire mentor took my side, the room hadn't noticed, but it wouldn't take long before the ripple hit every corner. The first time Lena truly looked at me that evening, not glanced, not acknowledged out of politeness, but really looked, was nearly an hour after Edward's quiet speech. The reception had begun to fracture, the music fading into an ambient background as guests migrated from speeches to soft goodbyes. A few gathered around the fire pits on the far patio, others wandered back toward the inn in heels clutched in hand and jackets draped over shoulders. But Lena remained where she was, at the center of the now cleared dance floor, staring through the shifting crowd until our eyes finally met. There was no fury in her expression, no mask of joy, just something brittle, something that cracked beneath the weight of her own expectations. She moved toward me slowly, as if realizing too late that she had been walking in the wrong direction for years. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lower, the silk confidence of the day already beginning to wrinkle around the edges. I nodded once, then followed her through the side garden to a small bench near the pergola, shaded by wisteria and framed with string lights that flickered like uncertain thoughts. "I didn't know," she said quietly after a long pause. "About the estate. About all of it." "That was the point," I said, not unkindly. She hesitated, eyes trained on the gravel at her feet. "Why didn't you tell me? Would it have changed anything?" "I wouldn't have said what I said tonight. I wouldn't have embarrassed you." "You didn't embarrass me, Lena," I said, voice level. "You revealed yourself." She looked up sharply. "That's not fair." "But it's true," I replied. "You wanted a story that made sense to the room. A story where you were the one who did everything right, and I was the one who did too much." "That's not how I meant it." "It's exactly how you meant it," I said, "and you've meant it for years." She didn't deny it. She just sat there, hands clasped tightly in her lap, shoulders curved inward like the weight of her choices had finally found a place to settle. "I was jealous," she whispered, "but I couldn't say that out loud. Not when you had everything else." "What do you think I had, Lena?" "You were always so certain, so complete. You didn't need anyone. You didn't ask for anything. And that made the rest of us feel small." I took a slow breath. "I wasn't trying to make you feel small. I was just trying to survive in a world that told me I had to earn space to exist." "I didn't understand that," she admitted, "and I didn't want to. It was easier to laugh, to tell people you were intimidating, because if you were intimidating, then I didn't have to admit that I couldn't keep up." I turned slightly, looking at her now, not with judgment, but with a kind of distant sadness. "Do you know what I wanted most tonight?" She shook her head. "I wanted to sit at your table," I said. "Not the one near the kitchen, not the one where you seat people to disappear. I wanted to sit beside you, as your sister, as someone you didn't have to be afraid of." Tears rimmed her eyes then, but she didn't let them fall. Lena was always too proud for that. It was the only thing we ever truly had in common. "I didn't know how," she whispered, "how to make space for you." "It's not too late," she offered, voice cracking. "We can fix it." But that's when I knew. It was too late. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I had grown past needing to be invited. I had built the house. I didn't need to sit at anyone's table anymore. "I forgive you," I said gently. She reached out instinctively, hand brushing mine. But I didn't take it. Because this wasn't a beginning, it was closure. A quiet shift from wanting something to understanding why I no longer did. And as I stood, the lights from the reception behind us casting shadows along the path, I knew she felt it. That something between us had settled, not broken, not burned, but concluded. Her life-changing moment had come, but it had come too late. I walked away slowly, my heels clicking softly against the stone. No speech, no farewell, just the sound of someone choosing peace over performance. The wedding weekend faded like a season ending. One moment, the vineyard buzzed with light and laughter, and the next, it stood hushed in golden silence, the tables cleared, the champagne flutes packed, and the string lights blinking their last sleepy rhythm before being taken down. The estate returned to itself, still beautiful but quieter, as though exhaling after hosting a spectacle, and I, too, left without ceremony. There were no dramatic exits, no final glances. I didn't see Lena again after the garden. I didn't look back at the vineyard as I left. I simply checked out of the inn, rolled my luggage down the gravel path, and stepped into the sleek black car waiting at the bottom of the hill. It was not how most sisters would part after a wedding, but Lena and I had never been most sisters. We were something else now, maybe always had been. We were history in motion, and we'd finally reached a pause. Back in San Francisco, the Monday inbox rush barely registered. The numbers, the board requests, the capital calls, none of it felt urgent. For once, the rhythm of my work didn't feel like armor. It felt like background noise. I answered what needed answering. Then I sat in my office, sunlight pooling across the glass table, and pulled out a cream-colored envelope I'd found tucked beneath my room key the morning I left the estate. It had no name on the front, but inside was a letter, handwritten in careful strokes. The handwriting was familiar, not Lena's, older, neater. It was from Julian, the founder's grandson, and the original owner I'd negotiated the Hawthorne restoration with. I hadn't seen him since the final legal filings. He'd taken his payment and stepped aside as planned, but there had always been a quiet understanding between us, a mutual respect. I unfolded the letter and began to read. Vanessa, if you're reading this, it means you came back. Quietly, as always. I thought about sending this through formal channels, but that felt wrong. Because this place, this vineyard, was never a business to me. And you, though you walked in as a businesswoman, didn't treat it like one either. You saw something here. You saw the bones beneath the decay. You rebuilt it not just to make it profitable, but to make it whole. What I never told you, because I wasn't sure it mattered, is that my grandfather left behind a clause in the estate's oldest operating charter, a clause that grants symbolic custodianship to whoever restores the vineyard after a generational downturn. It was never meant to be legal leverage, just legacy, a nod to the person who gives something back when the world forgets it. I found the original document last year, buried in the family archives. I had it framed and stored in the library. If you're ever back at Hawthorne, go there. Open the second drawer on the left beneath the window seat. You'll see it. And you'll see what he called that role. Keeper of Continuance. It's not a title you'll put on a resume. It won't impress any boardrooms, but it means something here, to this land, to the people who live by it, and now, to me, because you are that keeper. You brought Hawthorne back, and whatever happens next, know this. Your fingerprints are part of its future, even long after the crowd forgets your name. With respect to Julian. I sat back in my chair, the letter still open in my lap. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unapologetic and fast. But something inside me felt slower now, calmer, not because of recognition, but because of continuance. That word landed harder than anything Lena had said all weekend. Because in all my years of building, defending, and proving, I hadn't realized what I was really doing wasn't just success. It was stewardship. I didn't build legacies to own them. I built them to carry them forward. I closed the letter and smiled, because the hidden legacy had never been the estate. It had never been the wedding, not even the silence I weaponized so precisely. The legacy was endurance, clarity, grace under dismissal, and the quiet knowing that value never needs to announce itself. I didn't tell Lena about the letter. I didn't need to. I didn't call Julian either. That day, I simply packed my briefcase, left the office early, and stopped by a flower stall near the Embarcadero. I picked a bundle of lavender, the same scent woven through the halls of Hawthorne, and placed it beside the binder on my desk. A reminder that no matter how they laughed, excluded, or underestimated me, I had always known how to write my own story, and now so had history. It was a pale ivory envelope, printed with looping script and embossed with gold, a wedding invitation that arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as I was returning from a site meeting in Los Angeles. I remembered the way it slid through the mail slot, the way it landed on the hallway console like it already knew it would be ignored. I had held it for weeks. It sat unopened on my kitchen counter, under a glass paperweight, beside a stack of contracts and design mock-ups I was reviewing for my next resort project. I hadn't thrown it away. I hadn't mailed back the RSVP. I simply let it exist, silent and unanswered, a ghost of expectation resting among the living. There had been no anger, no righteous speech about rejection. It wasn't that I didn't care. I cared more deeply than I wanted to admit. But there are certain moments in a woman's life where silence becomes a power play, not a weakness, where choosing not to respond is the most definitive answer of all. So I let it sit. Lena's invitation was beautifully curated, clearly designed by someone with a Pinterest board and a high-end planner. The calligraphy read, "You are cordially invited to the marriage of Lena Grace Whitmore and Thomas Ellis Montgomery. A Vineyard wedding, June 10th. Evening attire, adults only." There was no +1 listed, not for me. She knew what that meant. And so did I. And still, I went. I went without a response, without fanfare, without playing by the unspoken rules. And now, sitting alone by the bay window in my San Francisco apartment, 3 weeks after that wedding, I sipped coffee from a porcelain cup and finally picked up that envelope again. My thumb traced the embossed corners, the weight of the cardstock now oddly poetic. I flipped it over, opened it for the first time, and looked at the RSVP card tucked inside. 2 boxes, accepts with pleasure, declines with regret. I took a pen from the drawer, drew a 3rd box beneath them, and wrote beside it, in neat block letters, "Walked in with purpose, walked out with peace." Then I folded the card, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it gently in the small drawer of my hallway table, where I kept other unsent letters. A memory now, sealed not by postage, but by growth. I never needed to send it, because the message had already been received. She knew, they all knew, that the sister they once called intimidating didn't just attend the wedding. She owned it, not with arrogance, not with spectacle, but with grace, restraint, and a quiet kind of elegance that doesn't ask to be acknowledged, but is impossible to ignore. I stood from the table and pulled my jacket over my shoulders. Another meeting awaited, another restoration project, this time a family-run mountain lodge looking for new life. I'd already sketched the bones of the redesign in my head: warm wood, open light, textures that remembered history without clinging to it, just like me. Before leaving, I glanced back at the table where the invitation rested. A smile touched my lips. Not because I'd won, but because I'd never needed to compete. There's a power in choosing your own narrative, a power in not returning the RSVP, a power in walking away without looking back. What stayed with me most in writing this story wasn't the moment the billionaire uncle bowed, or the gasp that echoed across the vineyard. It was the quiet, deliberate act of not returning the RSVP, the choice to show up, not to be seen, but to stand tall in her own presence. Vanessa didn't seek revenge through confrontation or chaos. She chose the more difficult path: restraint, poise, and private power. She taught us that dignity doesn't whisper or roar, it simply remains, long after the music fades. This is not just a story of being underestimated and rising above. It's a reminder that sometimes the most unforgettable victories are the ones no one sees coming, because they were never for show. They were for peace. If this story touched you, subscribe to Revenge with Seren. Because some revenge needs no knives, no screaming, just one spotlight and one shining nameplate. And someone they once dismissed rising, brilliant and unshaken. See you in the next story.